Welcome to Food Supply Unchained, a podcast aiming to explore and discuss the U.S. government regulations and policies that shape our food supply chain. I'm your host, Christine Heiser, and today we're going to discuss how our current food safety laws originated and have evolved over centuries. Before I can talk about what's currently happening in the world of food safety legislation, we're going to need to talk a little history because our ability to walk into any grocery store and pick from shelf stable jarred sauces and dried pastas, frozen dinners and desserts, whole fresh fruit and vegetables, oftentimes with organic options, deli meats and sliced cheeses, cryovac meats, and milk with an expiration date of 45 days out. And there may be a lot of things we think about while we're food shopping: pricing, macronutrients, brand, recipes. But when was the last time you wondered whether or not your food was actually safe to eat or contained the products it claimed on the label? Food safety is something most of us have taken for granted our whole lives, and foodborne illness is incredibly dangerous, especially to children and older folks. Food manufacturers and service establishments are under pressure to maintain training and regularly practice clearly defined food safety protocols to ensure our safety. These protocols have been created over time and prevent cross contamination and temperature abuse, which puts us in the path of dangerous bacteria, chemicals, and foreign objects. Historical accounts of foodborne illness date back to 323 BCE. Based on research of historical records, doctors at the University of Maryland's Medical Center believe that Alexander the Great was the victim of typhoid fever, which was caused by Salmonella typhi. This study suggests that he may have been the first documented case of foodborne illness. American colonists enacted the Massachusetts Act against selling unwholesome provisions on March 8, 1785, making it illegal to sell diseased, corrupted, contagious, or unwholesome food without informing the buyer, and essentially was the first U.S. food safety law. It was based on the assize of bread and ale, which was a 13th century English law that regulated the quality, price, and weight of bread and beer. The public's interest in the transparency of their food supply chain has been around since before the High Middle Ages. It can be assumed that since our ability to harvest and sell food and beverages, people have found ways to cut corners for profit. Our act was passed before the U.S. Constitution was finalized, and the states were responsible for food safety for the next 100 years. And everything was fine, and no one was corrupt or greedy. The end. Just kidding. Things got weird, and President Abraham Lincoln had to get involved. In 1862, Lincoln signed into law an act of Congress to establish the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, and appointed chemist Charles Witherell to head up the Division of Chemistry. And in 1901, the division transitioned into the Bureau of Chemistry. And then in 1906, the Bureau evolved again, this time into the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And the first two pieces of federal regulations regarding food safety were signed into law by President Theodore Roosevelt. The first law was the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which prohibited the sale of adulterated or misbranded meat and meat products, as well as ensured that meat and meat products were slaughtered and processed under sanitary conditions. This law was the government's response to the public's outcry upon reading Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, which exposed the horrific work conditions of the Chicago stockyards and led to the passing of the FMIA, as well as other work safety improvements to the American slaughterhouses. Now, full disclosure, while researching, I reread the book and got so distracted that I almost didn't finish writing the episode. I was absolutely blown away by its relevance. The book reads like a retelling of an old story, even though Sinclair was writing it about the current times and society he was living in, while also reading like a book written and relevant to today. I love this book so much that I will likely do an episode talking exclusively about the impact this piece of art had on our laws. I cannot recommend this book enough, and that's all I'll say about it for now. Okay. So we still benefit from this piece of legislation to this day. Mandated meat inspections, strict sanitation and safety standards. I mean, think about it. Most of our meat produced is crossing state lines, and this piece of legislation created a process for supporting interstate commerce. Up until now, states were solely responsible for food safety, but what happens at the turn of the century when each state has its own set of food safety laws? How will we establish and monitor processes required to ensure steaks produced and shipped out of Chicago, Kansas City, and Omaha are safely transported to customers in New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans? The establishment of federal oversight. That's how. The meatpacking industry had to and did develop a nationwide and international distribution system, ensuring that beef from the Midwest could reach consumers thousands of miles away in a relatively short time. This involved advancements in manufacturing and transportation. Another piece of food safety legislation spurred by the jungle and passed by Teddy Roosevelt was the Pure Food and Drug Act, which protects us from unsafe and mislabeled food and medicines. Pieces of this legislation include prohibiting the misbranding of food and drugs, meaning manufacturers cannot make false claims about ingredients or health benefits. Up until this point, harmful and fraudulent medicines were being sold, and tonics containing dangerous levels of alcohol or narcotics raised public health concerns. This law made it so that medications have to disclose that they contain alcohol or morphine. We were at the tail end of the American Industrial Revolution, and knowing which medications contain narcotics before starting to operate machinery used to process and transport livestock and meats was, I think we can all agree, important information to have. People were losing fingers and limbs left and right. And if you think manufacturing stopped when this happened, it definitely did not before there were laws mandating it. It was all just a part of how the sausage got made. The law was revised in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938 and contained several new provisions. It extended the FDA's oversight to include cosmetics and therapeutic devices. It mandated that new drugs must be shown safe before selling and advertising can begin. This also started a new system of drug regulation. It mandated that safe tolerances be set for unavoidable poisonous substances. It authorized factory inspections, and it increased the ability of the FDA to prosecute manufacturers at fault. The law was amended again in 1958 to include the Food Additive Amendment due to consumer concerns about the impact of unknown chemicals in processed foods and ensure the safety of ingredients used to preserve shelf life. This revision was in response to the popularity of processed foods that began in the 50s as women who worked in and out of the home began to prioritize fast and affordable meals to feed the family. Food additives have been used since ancient times. Salt, honey, vinegar, smoke have always been used to preserve food. But the mid 20th century saw the rise of synthetic additives. Post World War II, companies developed artificial flavors, colors, and preservatives to meet the demand for convenient foods. Additives such as MSG, BHA, BHT, and artificial sweeteners became common in processed foods. And in 1958, the American people wanted safety testing on these chemicals, which this new piece of legislation delivered. The law was then amended again in 1997 in the Food, Drug, and Modernization Act, which expanded the FDA's authority to regulate health and nutrient content claims. This means a company cannot link a health benefit to a particular food component without scientifically valid data. Just a heads up, one thing about me is that I believe decisions around regulating anything should almost always be rooted in available scientifically valid data. It will likely be a common theme for me when discussing food safety regulation, and I'm unlikely to consider opinions that do not factor in available valid data. Anyway, back to 1997. As nutrient dense as blueberries, kale, and salmon are, there's no such thing as one superfood that will undo an otherwise unhealthy lifestyle. Our bodies need a variety of nutrients all working together, not just one super ingredient, and it's because of this law that food and drug manufacturers cannot falsely claim to have a magic bullet for health. This is why dietary supplements can be dangerous because, unlike food and drugs, supplements do not need FDA approval before going to market. So, I strongly advise talking to your doctor before you start taking anything, but especially anything not regulated. Okay, I could talk all day about each piece of food safety legislation and their impacts on public trust, but I'll just mention a few more important federal laws and initiatives that have been passed. In 1949, the FDA issued its first guidance procedures for the appraisal of the toxicity of chemicals in food. In 1957, the Poultry Products Inspection Act addressed the growing market for processed poultry. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy established the Consumer Bill of Rights during a message to Congress. Included in this address are the right to safety, the right to be informed, the right to choose, and the right to be heard. This legislation influenced numerous future food safety acts. In 1967, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act prevented unfair or deceptive packaging and labeling of many household products, including foods. In 1970, the CDC began tracking foodborne illness related deaths, initiating modern outbreak data collection. In 1973, the first major U.S. food recall occurred after canned mushrooms caused a nationwide illness outbreak. 75 million cans of mushrooms were removed from store shelves due to botulism contamination. Yes, that botulinum toxin, also known as Botox, which is a medical procedure using highly controlled, diluted, and purified forms of the botulinum toxin to treat a variety of conditions, including wrinkles, underarm sweating, and chronic migraines. That being said, they are among the most potent neurotoxins known, capable of causing botulism, which is a severe and potentially fatal illness that leads to paralysis. Botulinum toxin remains a significant bioterrorism concern because it thrives in low oxygen, low acid environments, creating a potential hazard in improperly canned or preserved foods, which is why you can't be out in this world eating food that was canned in just anyone's kitchen. That's just a little unsolicited advice from me to you. You're welcome. In 1977, the Food Safety and Quality Service was established for meat and poultry inspection and then renamed Food Safety and Inspection Services, or FSIS, in 1981. In 1996, the FSIS introduced pathogen reduction HACCP systems. HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. Food producers and manufacturers identify every single point in their food receiving, storage, and production processes where food is at risk of coming into contact with a contaminant or the temperature danger zone. From there, a management system is designed to mitigate these risks. A giant binder is usually created and the staff is trained accordingly. If you've ever worked in a kitchen in the US, you've likely created and or participated in a HACCP plan. In 2000, the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, was launched to standardize food safety management systems. The United States has traditionally been a major importer of beef, poultry, and pork, sourcing meat from various countries, including Australia, Canada, and Mexico. And as of recording, I do not know how Trump's tariffs will impact the availability of animal proteins in the US. Mexico is the largest exporter of fruits and vegetables to the United States, and as of recording, I do not know how Trump's tariffs will impact the availability of produce in the US. The US imports a large amount of seafood, with an estimated 70 to 85% of seafood consumed domestically coming from international sources. And as of recording, I do not know how Trump's tariffs will impact the availability of seafood in the US. My point in bringing up the newly imposed import tariffs is that most of what we eat comes from other countries. And similar to our need for a system of regulations to safely transport beef from the Midwest to other states, standardizing international food safety management systems protects a public that consumes mostly imported food. In 2011, Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, focused FDA efforts on preventative measures. Foreign Supplier Verification Program means importers must verify that their imported food meets U.S. safety standards. Sanitation transportation of human and animal food means shippers must ensure safe transportation of food by addressing vehicle design, refrigeration, and sanitation practices. Other rules include produce safety rule, protection against international adulteration, accredited third party certification, preventative control rule for human and animal food, and voluntary qualified importer programs. I'm not going to say it again. Oh, yes, I am, because it's that important. As of recording, I don't know how the new tariffs will impact this, but I do know that there will be a significant disruption to our imported food supply chain, and that is going to be a very big deal. In 2020, the FDA released the blueprint for a new era of smarter food safety, emphasizing traceability and digital technology. And while these laws and agencies aim to protect public interest, they also create hurdles for businesses to navigate. Compliance with regulations requires resources, including time, money, which puts smaller businesses at a disadvantage. Many critics argue government regulations disproportionately burden smaller companies because there's less revenue to offset the fixed costs of regulatory compliance. US federal government regulations cost an estimated $3.079 trillion dollars in 2022, and that's in 2023 dollars, an amount equal to 12% of the US GDP. The annual cost per employee for all federal regulations was on average $12,200 per employee for businesses with 100 or more employees, $13,800 for businesses with between 50 and 99 employees, which is a cost increase of 13%, and $14,700 for businesses with less than 50 employees, which is an additional cost increase of 6.5%. This means it costs a business with less than 50 employees $2,500 more per employee than companies employing more than 100. These estimates are inclusive of economic, environmental, tax compliance, and OSHA regulations. But my point is that whenever rules are added to how businesses operate, training, oversight, and administrative costs will be incurred. And unfortunately, our system is set to benefit those with more resources than less. Proponents of deregulation argue that lower operations costs allow more businesses to enter our market, which lowers prices for consumers. And these factors can help stimulate efficiency and lead to increased economic growth. Consideration of these factors are important when creating legislation, and there should be resources allocated for small businesses to navigate the barriers of market entry, but not at the cost of our safety. I want to acknowledge that the US has a history where the intended benefits of regulations have been diluted by federal corruption. There are no shortages of bribery, lobbying, extortion, cronyism, nepotism, parochialism, influence peddling, and embezzlement. Take regulatory capture, for example, which is a form of political corruption that occurs when a policymaker or a regulator is brought in to serve the commercial, ideological, or political interests of a minor constituency. These special interest groups devote large budgets to influencing regulators, while individual citizens have limited resources to advocate for our rights. Oftentimes, these rogue regulators will impose barriers to entry, such as licenses, permits, and certifications if need, without which a business may not legally operate in a market or industry. I want to be clear, this does happen, and critics of federal government regulations are correct to call out these points. We have an obligation to our country to stop the federal government from overstepping its constitutional limits and encroaching on state authority. This does not mean we remove systems of rules created on the lessons we've learned over the last 200 years before labor ethics and science strengthened the safety of our nation's food supply. In fact, food safety legislation plays a major role in the progression of federal regulations. In a paper called Retooling American Feudalism by University of Vermont's Law School, Lori Baranavand, and University of Indiana, Robert H. McKinney School of Law's Diana Winters notes, quote, food policy action on state and local levels is necessary and important for two reasons. First, the complexity and breadth of our nation's food system requires layered policy and regulation. The system's functioning needs both national uniformity and local distinctions. Second, there are crucial gaps in national regulation that provide rich opportunities for state and local action. These gaps in areas such as regulation of antibiotics in animal feed and the oversight of food additives are not priorities of federal agencies that oversee food. Although the FDA has made nutrition policy a priority for 2018, the current administration's explicitly articulated anti regulatory agenda makes it unlikely that these previously under-prioritized areas will be addressed. End quote. This paper was written in 2018, refers to the Donald Trump administration, and is as relevant today as it was almost 7 years ago. So, why am I telling you this? Why am I sitting at a microphone putting this information out into the podcast abyss? Because we're entering an era of deregulation, and with that may come companies choosing profit over safety. And though deregulation does have some benefits, such as lowering cost of operations, which in turn allows more businesses to enter the market and drives down costs for consumers. And as mentioned before, these factors can help stimulate efficiency and lead to increased economic growth. However, regulation exists in large part to minimize the negative externalities that materialize in the absence of market guardrails. Laws establishing and enforcing safety and transparency of food production, transportation, and sales is the reason we feel safe walking into most grocery stores and restaurants and eat without hesitation. A business's ability to produce a safe product in a sustainable and ethical way should be a barrier to market entry because the risk is too great. State laws should subsidize the deficiencies in federal laws, not replace them entirely. A good example of state laws needing to support federal law dates back to 1993. A popular fast food burger chain was involved in an E. coli outbreak that affected 732 people across 4 states, permanently injuring 178 people and sadly killing 4 children. Health inspectors traced the contamination to 2 sources. The first source was their supplier, who sold meat contaminated with E. coli. The subsequent investigation by the CDC identified 5 slaughterhouses in the US and one in Canada as the quote, likely sources of the contaminated lots of meat, end quote. In February 1998, the parent company for the restaurant chain agreed to accept 58.5 million from the supplier and 8 other beef suppliers to settle the lawsuit. The second source of the outbreak was traced back to a special promotion which sold these burgers at a discount. The high demand for the limited time offer overwhelmed the restaurant's kitchen, and the patties were not cooked long enough or at a high enough temperature to kill the bacteria all the way through the burger. At the time of this outbreak, there was no uniform federal standard for ensuring the safety of meat products across all states. The outbreak exposed the limitations of state level food safety enforcement and the need for more comprehensive federal oversight. There were inconsistencies in state regulations, such as states not having the same mandatory standards for pathogen testing and meat handling. Regardless of the contaminated meat, had the burgers been cooked to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit, this E. coli break would have never happened. We need laws to guide businesses to establish a food temperature danger zone and what temperatures are required to kill harmful pathogens. That's why you see consumer risk signs at restaurants that serve meat or seafood cooked under 165 degrees. It's an eat at your own risk situation. Anyhow, in this episode, I hope I started a conversation around the importance of a transparent food supply chain. I want us to keep talking about how we are going to maintain access to food safety information if and when federal programs, administrations, and laws are eliminated. When I try to think objectively about food safety legislation, I start by considering 3 points: who is protected, what is the risk, and who makes money if these laws are passed or eliminated. I had a great time talking about this and would love to continue the discussion. If you enjoyed the content and are interested in listening to future episodes, please like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I can also be reached at foodsupplyunchained.com. Goodbye and be safe.